Welcome, dear viewers, to another journey through time. Today, we drift into the echoes of the past, a world shaped by ancient tribes, fierce struggles, and the unbreakable spirit of a people who refused to be forgotten. As we unravel the story that shaped a nation, sit back, relax, and let history guide your imagination. If you love exploring forgotten eras, powerful empires, and the turning points that changed our world, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode from our growing history family. Now, let's step into the past together. Ireland's story begins in a world beyond memory, in a time when the island was untouched by the ambitions and conflicts that would later shape its destiny. Before the Celts arrived, before monasteries rose, before English rule cast its shadow, Ireland was a land of forests, rivers, bogs, and stone. It was a landscape waiting for humanity's footprint. And when those first footsteps finally arrived, they came carrying mysteries that still echo through the valleys and hills today. Archaeologists believe that the earliest settlers reached Ireland around 8000 BC during the Mesolithic period. These were small groups of hunter-gatherers who crossed the cold waters from Britain or continental Europe in simple boats. They settled along riverbanks and coastlines, surviving on fish, shellfish, and the animals of the wild forests. Their homes were temporary shelters, their tools made of stone and bone. They left no written words, no carved monument sand, yet their presence was the first brushstroke in the long mural of Irish history. Thousands of years later, a transformation began. Around 4000 BC, Neolithic farmers arrived, bringing with them something that would forever change the island: agriculture. For the first time, the people of Ireland began to cultivate land, raise animals, and live in permanent settlements. These Neolithic people cleared forests, built stone houses, and created communities that depended on cooperation and shared labor. But their achievements were far greater than mere farming. They built monuments, massive stone structures that defy imagination even today. The most famous of these is Newgrange, a passage tomb older than the pyramids of Egypt and older than Stonehenge. It stands as a silent testament to a people who understood the movements of the sun and moon with astonishing precision. On the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, a beam of sunlight illuminates the inner chamber of Newgrange, revealing carvings that have waited in the darkness for millennia. To this day, the event draws visitors from around the world, reminding us of the genius and spirituality of Ireland's earliest farmers. They also built other sites, each one an enigma carved into stone. These monumental constructions were not simple tombs. They were expressions of a worldview in which life, death, nature, and the cosmos were woven into one spiritual fabric. These Neolithic builders looked to the sky for guidance and honored their dead with structures that required generations of planning and labor. No one knows the names of the people who conceived them, but their work forms the foundation of Ireland's ancient identity. As centuries passed, the Neolithic world slowly faded, replaced by new cultures, new technologies, and new ideas carried across the sea. Around 2500 BC, the Bronze Age dawned. Metalwork arrived, first copper, then bronze, bringing stronger tools, better weapons, and more efficient agriculture. Ireland entered a new era of craftsmanship. Metalworkers cast delicate jewelry, tools, and ceremonial objects. The people built stone circles, standing stones, and burial mounds that reflected their evolving beliefs. Trade networks developed: amber from the Baltic, gold from the Wicklow Mountains, and bronze tools exchanged hands across the island. Power structures formed, and communities became more complex. These were the early roots of tribal identities that would later define Irish society. But the most dramatic transformation came with the arrival of a new people, those who would shape Ireland's cultural soul for more than 2,000 years. Around 500 BC, the Celts arrived. The Celts were not a single tribe, nor a single nation. They were a collection of Indo-European peoples spread across Europe, from the Alps to the Iberian Peninsula, from Italy to Gaul and the British Isles. Their language, customs, and worldview formed a rich tapestry. And when they arrived in Ireland, that tapestry blended with the ancient traditions already rooted in the land. The Celts brought iron stronger than bronze, sharper than anything Ireland had seen before. They brought new farming techniques, new social structures, and new forms of art marked by swirling patterns, spirals, and knotwork that still define Irish design today. They introduced a warrior culture built on honor, loyalty, and bravery. But perhaps their most lasting contribution was their mythology. Celtic Ireland became a land of stories of heroes, of gods who walked among men. According to tradition, the island was once the realm of the Tuatha Dé Danann, a supernatural race of warriors, poets, and sorcerers who later retreated into the hills and mounds, becoming the city or fairy folk of Irish legend. When the Celts arrived, they merged with these mythological ancestors, blending reality and myth into a single narrative. Their legends gave Ireland a spiritual identity, one that saw nature as alive with meaning and mystery. Celtic society was organized around tribes, each ruled by a ru or king. These kings were not monarchs in the modern sense. They ruled with the consent of their people and could be replaced if they failed in their duties. The land was not owned by kings, but by clans, and loyalty to one's kin was the foundation of Celtic life. At the heart of this society stood a powerful class, the Druids. Druids were more than priests. They were judges, poets, healers, historians, astronomers, and advisors to kings. They held immense influence, for they carried the memory of the people. Celtic tradition was oral. Knowledge was not written down but recited, memorized, and passed across generations through stories, law codes, and ritual chants. A druid might spend 20 years learning his craft, mastering everything from myths to mathematics. Their presence shaped Celtic beliefs and guided political decisions. War played a central role in Celtic society. Battles were often ritualistic, fought for honor or territory. Warriors decorated their bodies with paint, charged into battle with ferocious courage, and believed that a glorious death secured immortality in the other world. Yet the Celts were also skilled farmers, artists, musicians, and storytellers. Their music played on harps and flutes carried through festivals that celebrated the cycles of nature. Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, Lughnasadh. Festivals still recognized in Irish culture today. Ireland during the Celtic Age was not a single kingdom, but a mosaic of roughly 150 tribes, each with its own customs and territories. Yet there was unity in diversity. They shared a language, Gaelic Irish, and shared spiritual beliefs centered around the natural world. Sacred groves, rivers, hills, and stones were honored as dwellings of gods and ancestral spirits. The land itself was alive, and to mistreat it was to invite misfortune. Out of this world came legendary heroes like Sue Tulane, the Hound of Ulster, whose strength and courage shaped the Ulster cycle, and Fionn mac Cumhaill, leader of the Fianna, whose wisdom and adventure fill the Fenian cycle. These stories were not mere entertainment. They were the psychological foundation of Celtic identity, tales of loyalty, sacrifice, bravery, and the complex relationship between humans and the divine. The Celts also introduced a system of laws, known as Brehon law, one of the oldest legal traditions in Europe. These laws emphasized compensation over punishment, fairness over brutality. Women could own property, lead clans, become poets or druids, and even divorce their husbands under certain conditions. This made Celtic Ireland unusually progressive for its time. As centuries passed, Celtic culture became deeply rooted in Ireland, shaping every aspect of life. Yet, despite their warrior spirit, the Celts did not build empires. They preferred decentralized rule, personal honor, and tribal autonomy. This gave Irish society great cultural richness, but also made the island vulnerable to future invasions. For now, however, Ireland thrived in relative isolation, developing a distinct identity and a vibrant society driven by creativity, spirituality, and tradition. By the time the 1st century AD arrived, the Celts had fully transformed Ireland. They cleared forests for farming, forged alliances through marriage, built hill forts and ring forts, and expanded their influence. Their trade networks connected them to Britain, Gaul, and beyond. Ireland was not isolated. It was part of a broader Celtic world. Yet, despite their connections, Ireland remained unconquered by the Roman Empire. While Britain fell under Roman rule, Ireland stayed free. Roman writers referred to the island as Hibernia, describing it as a place of fierce warriors and skilled traders. But the Romans never attempted full conquest, and Ireland maintained its independence during a time when much of Europe fell under imperial control. This isolation protected Celtic traditions, while Roman roads, cities, and laws reshaped Britain. Ireland continued developing along its own path. Its society remained tribal, its religion rooted in nature, its political structure decentralized. The Druids maintained their authority, and Celtic mythology continued to thrive. A deep connection to the land, a reverence for ancestors, a love for poetry and story, a code of honor that valued courage and loyalty. These values would endure through But even as Celtic Ireland reached its height, change was coming. Unseen forces were gathering in distant lands, new religions, new tribes, new empires that would eventually reach Ireland's shores and reshape its destiny. The arrival of Christianity, the invasion of Vikings, and the dominance of English rule were still far in the future, but the roots of the Irish spirit, planted in the soil by Celts and their predecessors, were strong. They would allow Ireland to survive every storm. The story of Ireland begins with these early people hunters, farmers, builders, warriors, poets, each adding their own layers to the island's legacy. By the time the Celts established their dominance, Ireland had become a unique cultural world, unlike any other in Europe. It was a world of myth and memory, of stone monuments and sacred groves, of tribal pride and artistic brilliance. And it was this world that would shape Ireland for thousands of years to come, forming the foundation upon which all later chapters of its history would be built. Celtic Ireland stood as one of the most unique societies in ancient Europe. For centuries after the Celts arrived around 500 BC, the island developed its own independent rhythm distinct from Roman rule, untouched by foreign kings, and shaped by its own traditions of law, poetry, and spirituality. It was a world woven together by stories and rituals, by the wisdom of druids and the courage of warriors. Yet, as the centuries passed, this vibrant Celtic world began to encounter an idea far more powerful than any sword or kingdom: faith. But to understand the transformation that Christianity brought, we must first step into the heart of Celtic Ireland itself, Ireland alive with myth, a society structured by tribes and governed by ancient customs. It was a place where life moved according to the seasons, where the landscape itself was sacred, and where the line between the natural and supernatural was thin enough to walk across. Imagine an Ireland covered in deep forests, rivers winding like silver threads, and countless hill forts rising above the land. These hill forts were the centers of tribal life places, where kings met, where warriors gathered, where feasts were held and decisions made. A tribe's territory might stretch across rolling hills and valleys, marked not by walls or borders, but by ancestral memory. Everyone knew the land, because the land defined who they were. In these tribes, the king or was not a distant monarch, but a living symbol of prosperity. His role was to ensure justice, secure peace, and oversee ceremonies tied to the cycles of nature. If crops failed, if cattle died, or if war brought disaster, the king was believed to have lost his spiritual connection to the land. He could be removed, replaced by another, chosen by the nobles and druids. The druids were the intellectual heartbeat of Celtic society. They were philosophers, judges, teachers, healers, astronomers, and keepers of knowledge. A druid was expected to memorize vast amounts of information, laws, genealogies, myths, rituals, and even the movements of the stars. Since writing was discouraged for sacred knowledge, druids carried centuries of tradition in their minds alone. Their training could last up to 20 years. They resolved disputes, advised kings, and performed the rituals that bound the tribe to its ancestors and gods. Religion permeated every aspect of life. The Celts worshipped a pantheon of gods and goddesses, each tied to the natural world: rivers, mountains, forests, and seasons. Sites such as rivers and wells were believed to hold spiritual power. Offerings were left at sacred places, and ceremonies were often held outdoors, where nature itself formed a temple. There were festivals marking the turning of the year, Samhain, the beginning of winter, and a time when spirits crossed into the human world: Imbolc, celebrating the first light of spring; Beltane, marking summer's arrival through fire rituals; and Lugnasad, a festival of harvest and athletic games. These ceremonies connected every tribe to the rhythms of life. In this world of spirituality and custom, storytelling was the heartbeat of culture. Bards and poets held enormous power because they preserved memory. They knew the sagas of legendary heroes like Tuatha, Chulainn, and Funmac, Cumhaill. They recited genealogies of kings, the histories of tribes, and the ancient tales of gods and spirits. A poet could immortalize a king or destroy his reputation with satire. Words were as powerful as weapons, yet for all its richness, Celtic Ireland faced challenges. Intertribal rivalries created conflicts. Alliances could shift quickly, and feuds sometimes lasted generations. Without a unified central government, Ireland's tribes existed in a delicate balance. Still, despite their divisions, they shared a common cultural foundation: language, beliefs, festivals, and a deep respect for tradition. Into this complex world came an unexpected influence: new religion emerging from distant lands, spreading slowly across Europe, carried by missionaries and travelers. Christianity began its contact with Ireland long before it took root, traveling through merchants, sailors, and possibly escaped slaves. But the true turning point came with the arrival of a man whose story would become inseparable from Irish identity: Patrick. Patrick's journey to Ireland did not begin as a missionary. It began as a prisoner. Born in Britain during the late Roman period, he grew up in a family of minor officials. But around the age of 16, he was captured by Irish raiders, one of the many groups that crossed the sea to plunder Roman settlements. Taken to Ireland, he became a slave, forced to tend sheep in the lonely hills and forests. For years, he lived in isolation, his survival dependent on resilience and faith in his writings. Patrick describes this captivity as a time of profound spiritual awakening. In the solitude of the fields, he turned to prayer. Eventually, he escaped and returned to his family, but he carried Ireland in his heart and in his dreams. According to his own account, he later received a vision calling him back to the island, not as a slave, but as a messenger of Christianity. When Patrick returned to Ireland around 432 AD, he entered a world that was deeply rooted in its own beliefs. But he also entered a world that respected learning, spiritual authority, and ritual elements that allowed Christianity to find acceptance. Patrick was not the first Christian to set foot in Ireland, but he became the most influential. He preached across the island, baptized converts, and built churches on land given to him by local rulers. Patrick's approach was uniquely suited to Ireland. He did not try to erase Celtic culture. Instead, he worked with it. He adapted Christian teachings to fit the rhythms of Irish life. He used familiar symbols and rituals, linking Celtic spirituality to Christian ideas. He spoke to kings and druids with respect, relying on persuasion rather than force. Through patience, resilience, and humility, Patrick planted the seeds of a transformation that would reshape Ireland forever. As Christianity took hold, a new chapter in Irish history began, one characterized not by conquest or destruction, but by creativity, scholarship, and spiritual devotion. Christianity did not replace the past. It built upon it, merging with Celtic tradition in a way that created something entirely new. One of the most remarkable outcomes of this cultural blending was the rise of Irish monasticism. Unlike monasteries in the Roman world, Irish monasteries were not simply places of prayer. They were centers of learning, agriculture, craftsmanship, and community life. Each monastery became a miniature world, a place where monks studied scriptures, copied manuscripts, practiced medicine, taught literature, and preserved histories. These monasteries became vital in preserving knowledge during the centuries when much of Europe fell into turmoil after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. One of the most famous monasteries was located on the island of Iona, founded by the Irish monk Columba in the 6th century. From this small island off the coast of Scotland, missionaries traveled across Britain and Europe, spreading Christianity and establishing new monastic communities. The influence of Irish monks extended far beyond Ireland itself. They became known as scholars, teachers, and travelers who carried light into places darkened by war and chaos. Irish scribes created some of the most beautiful illuminated manuscripts in history. The Book of Kells, for example, is a masterpiece of Celtic and Christian art, filled with intricate patterns, vivid colors, and elaborate designs that reflect both spiritual devotion and artistic genius. Each page is a world of its own, a celebration of creativity and faith. But beyond art and scholarship, Christianity brought new social structures. The tribal system slowly adapted to new rules of land ownership, alliance, and moral conduct. Monasteries became power centers, often controlling large tracts of land. They influenced politics, economics, and daily life. Yet Christianity did not extinguish the Celtic spirit. It coexisted with older beliefs for centuries. Even as people attended churches, they continued celebrating traditional festivals, preserving customs linked to the natural world. Monks recorded myths and heroic tales, ensuring that stories of the ancient gods and heroes were never forgotten. Instead of suppressing the past, they preserved it, giving future generations access to Ireland's oldest traditions. In this period, Ireland earned its famous title, the Land of Saints and Scholars. It became a beacon of learning in a Europe where war, invasion, and political collapse had destroyed many centers of knowledge. Students traveled from afar to study in Irish monasteries. Irish monks traveled across Europe, founding schools, libraries. It created prayers that felt poetic, rituals that celebrated creation, and legends that blended Christian saints with the symbolism of earlier myths. But this flourishing golden age was not without challenges. As monasteries grew wealthy, rivalries emerged, not only between tribes, but between monasteries themselves. Kings sometimes fought for control of religious centers. Monasteries became targets for raids, both from rival Irish clans and later from foreign invaders who saw their treasures as irresistible. The peaceful centers of faith and learning would eventually face the fury of Viking warriors whose arrival would disrupt the island's harmony. Yet during these centuries between Patrick's mission and the coming of the Vikings, Ireland achieved something extraordinary. It became a society where ancient traditions survived alongside new beliefs. It became a lighthouse of scholarship during Europe's darkest centuries. It preserved knowledge, fostered creativity, and produced saints, poets, and scholars whose influence reached far beyond the island's shores. The transformation of Ireland during this period was not a simple religious conversion. It was a cultural renaissance, a merging of worlds, a fusion of Celtic imagination with Christian spirituality. It created a society unlike any other in medieval Europe. This fusion laid the foundation for what Ireland would become. It shaped the stories that Irish people told, the values they held, the art they created, and the identity they carried into future centuries. It prepared the island for the trials that lay ahead, trials that would come in the form of Viking invasions, Norman conquests, English domination, and centuries of rebellion and resistance. But before those storms arrived, Ireland experienced a golden age of harmony between old and new, a time when druids and monks walked the same paths, when tribal kings listened to Christian preachers, when ancient myths were preserved in libraries, and when the island shone as a center of learning in a world filled with uncertainty. Through this remarkable era, Ireland built a cultural identity strong enough to survive every challenge that would come, an identity rooted in memory, faith, creativity, and an unbreakable connection to the land. It was during this time that Ireland became, in the truest sense, Ireland. The centuries that followed the Christianization of Ireland would become some of the most remarkable periods in the island's entire history, an era of extraordinary intellectual flourishing, artistic mastery, and cultural confidence. Long before the rise of universities across medieval Europe, and even before many continental kingdoms had achieved any degree of stability after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, emerged as a shining beacon of scholarship. Monks, scribes, poets, and craftsmen transformed the island into what scholars later called the land of saints and scholars. This was not a simple or sudden transformation. It was the result of a profound cultural blending, meeting of the old Celtic world with the new Christian order, and the unique circumstances of Ireland's isolation from many of the devastating raids and migrations that shook mainland Europe. To understand how Ireland became an intellectual powerhouse, one must imagine the landscape of early medieval Europe. The Roman Empire had fallen in the west, leaving a patchwork of successor kingdoms struggling with wars, invasions, political fragmentation, and the loss of central institutions that once supported learning. Libraries diminished, schools disappeared, and literacy became scarce outside a small clerical class. But Ireland, never conquered by Rome and relatively untouched by the political turmoil of the continent, evolved differently. The island's tribal society, once centered on warrior prestige and oral tradition, found in Christianity not a replacement for its culture, but a structure that could enhance and preserve it. Christian monasteries took in the ancient Celtic reverence for poetic memory, legal knowledge, and oral lore, and placed it into written form. Monks became the inheritors of both worlds, the guardians of Celtic identity and the agents of Christian transformation. Monasteries were far more than religious centers. They were bustling communities that functioned as schools, farms, craft workshops, and even diplomatic hubs. A visitor walking into a monastery like Clonmacnoise in its prime would not merely see monks chanting prayers in stone churches. They would see teams of scribes hunched over wooden desks, meticulously copying sacred texts, artisans shaping intricate metalwork, students learning Latin grammar, travelers arriving with messages, and scholars debating theology or poetry. These monasteries were miniature cities of the mind, driven by the Irish love for language, storytelling, and learning. It is within these monastic centers that Ireland produced some of the most breathtaking manuscripts of the medieval world. The practice of illuminating manuscripts, decorating them with vivid colors, gold leaf, and elaborate imagery was not invented in Ireland, but Irish monks elevated it to unparalleled heights. The Book of Duro, the Lindisfarne Gospels, and the most famous of all, the Book of Kells, are dazzling examples of this art. Their swirling patterns, intricate Celtic knots, and radiant colors reflect both Christian symbolism and deep-rooted Celtic artistic traditions. These manuscripts were not simply books. They were expressions of a worldview where the divine and the natural world intertwined, where every line and color carried spiritual meaning. The monks believed that creating beauty in the service of God was an act of worship, and the result was a body of artwork that continues to astonish historians and artists to this day. But Irish scholarship extended far beyond art. Ireland became a center of linguistic and theological study. Monastic schools taught Latin, Greek, and occasionally even Hebrew. Monks studied the writings of church fathers like Augustine, Jerome, and Gregory the Great. They wrote detailed commentaries on the Bible, created theological treatises, developed systems for calculating the date of Easter, and recorded histories and genealogies. Some of this writing preserved fragments of earlier Celtic myths and legends, placing them into written form for the first time. Without Irish monks, many elements of ancient Gaelic mythology, including early versions of the Tainbor, Cailmage, and stories of legendary heroes like Thru Chulainn and Funmac, Cumhailmite, have been lost forever. Perhaps even more remarkable was the Irish tradition of preserving classical texts. At a time when much of Europe had lost access to works by ancient Greek and Roman authors, Irish monasteries collected, copied, and safeguarded them. This included texts by Virgil, Cicero, Ovid, and even scientific or philosophical writings. While Ireland did not preserve every classical work, we owe much of that preservation to Islamic scholars and to other Christian centers, as well. It undeniably played a role in safeguarding a portion of Europe's intellectual heritage. The phrase, "the Irish saved civilization," popularized by historian Thomas Cahill, is an exaggeration, yet it reflects an important truth. Irish monks contributed meaningfully to keeping the flame of classical and Christian learning alive during a difficult time. Irish monasticism was unique in structure. Unlike the hierarchical systems that developed later in continental Europe, Irish monasteries were often founded by charismatic leaders known as abbots. These abbots wielded considerable authorities, sometimes even more than bishops. Their influence extended not only within the monastery walls, but also among surrounding clans. Many monasteries were tied to particular families or tribes, creating spiritual dynasties where leadership passed from one relative to another. This blending of religious and tribal identity created a distinctive form of Christian community unlike anything found elsewhere. As monasteries grew, so did their connections to the wider world. Irish monks were not content to remain isolated. Instead, they embarked on voyages known as peregrine notio journeys, undertaken for spiritual reasons, often without the intention of returning home. Driven by a mix of missionary zeal and personal devotion, these monks traveled throughout the British Isles and deep into continental Europe. St. Columba, one of the most famous Irish missionaries, founded a monastery on the Scottish island of Iona, which later became a center of Christian influence in Scotland and northern England. From Iona emerged missionaries who converted the Picts and inspired other monastic foundations. Another renowned figure was Saint Columbanus, who traveled to Gaul, Switzerland, and Italy. He established monasteries at Luxeuil and Bobbio, both of which became major centers of learning and reform. Columbanus's teachings, which emphasized strict discipline, personal devotion, and monastic asceticism, influenced religious life across Europe. His Latin writings, letters, and sermons documented not only theological debates, but also encounters with kings, bishops, and political turmoil on the continent. Through figures like Columbanese, the Irish monastic revolution spread far beyond its shores. These missionaries brought with them distinct Irish practices, most notably a different method for calculating the date of Easter, a unique style of monastic rule, and a tradition of confession that differed from practices in Rome. While some of these differences created conflicts with continental authorities, they also sparked dialogue and reform. Over time, Irish monasticism integrated with the larger Christian world, but traces of its influence remained visible for centuries. Back home, life in the monasteries was a blend of prayer, labor, study, and artistic creation. The daily rhythm was marked by the many monasteries were economically self-sufficient, producing their own food, textiles, and tools. The simplicity of monastic life did not exclude the presence of beauty. Churches were often decorated with carved stonework, sculpted crosses, and painted images. Wooden structures, though less permanent, were often richly adorned. Yet, despite the peaceful image we often associate with monastic life, this era was not free from conflict. Monasteries could become targets in disputes between rival clans. Control over a wealthy monastery meant influence, resources, and prestige. Some abbots came from elite families and wielded considerable secular power. The boundaries between religious and political spheres were fluid, but even amidst these tensions, the intellectual and artistic output of the monasteries remained extraordinary. One of the great achievements of Irish monks was their system of annals, year-by-year records of important events. These annals documented not only political happenings but also natural phenomena, battles, dynastic changes, and even unusual occurrences like eclipses or comets. The Annals of Ulster, the Annals of Tigernach, and the Annals of the Four Masters provide historians today with invaluable information about early Irish history. Without these records, much of what we know about Ireland's past would have vanished in the mists of time. In addition to annals, Irish scholars produced a wealth of legal material. The Brehon Laws, a complex and highly developed system of early Irish law, were preserved and commented upon in monastic settings. These laws governed marriage, property, compensation, honor, price, and countless other aspects of life. They reflect a society that valued fairness, compensation over punishment, and the protection of community harmony. Christian monks did not erase these laws. Instead, they adapted them into a framework compatible with Christian ethics, ensuring that Ireland's legal heritage endured even as the island embraced a new faith. The new religious framework blended old customs with Christian values. The merging of Christian belief with Celtic tradition also produced a rich body of poetry and religious writing. Irish monks wrote hymns, prayers, and poems in both Latin and Old Irish. Some writings reveal a profound appreciation for nature, echoing older Celtic spirituality. A monk might describe the beauty of a stream, the behavior of birds, or the quiet peace of a forest as reflections of divine creation. Marginal notes in manuscripts, some humorous, some contemplative, reveal glimpses of daily life. A scribe complaining about the cold, another praising his cat, yet another lamenting the difficulty of copying Latin grammar. These small details humanized the scribes behind the great works. The golden age of learning also saw the rise of Irish metalwork and stone carving. Master craftsmen created ornate chalices, reliquaries, brooches, and bells. The Arda chalice and the Tara brooch are masterpieces of detailed metalwork, combining gold, silver, glass, and enamel in swirling Celtic patterns. High crosses, carved with biblical scenes and interlaced designs, stood outside monasteries and served as teaching tools for communities who could not read. These crosses remain among Ireland's most iconic historic monuments. This period of flourishing, however, began to face new challenges. Toward the end of the 8th century, the arrival of Viking raiders shook the island and brought sudden destruction to many monasteries. Yet even in the face of these raids, Irish monastic culture proved remarkably resilient. Some monasteries fortified their defenses, others relocated inland, still others rebuilt repeatedly after attacks. Over time, Vikings transitioned from raiders to settlers, and Irish and Norse communities interacted, traded, and blended in complex ways. The monastic tradition survived, though it changed as new political and cultural forces emerged. Despite external pressures, the legacy of the monastic Golden Age endured. It shaped Irish identity for generations, preserved vast amounts of knowledge, and influenced Christian culture far beyond Ireland's shores. Even centuries later, when political upheaval and foreign rule swept over the island, the memory of the monks' achievements remained a source of pride and inspiration. The story of this era is a testament to the power of learning, creativity, and spiritual devotion. It shows how a small island on the edge of Europe, far from the old centers of power, could become a beacon of light during one of history's darkest periods. The fusion of Celtic tradition and Christian faith produced a culture unlike any other, culture that valued wisdom, artistry, and the written word. And although time would bring new trials, the achievements of this golden age would forever remain a defining part of Ireland's historical soul. Ireland's early medieval brilliance, its monasteries, manuscripts, and scholars stood like a flame burning brightly on the western edge of Europe. But as the centuries passed, that flame faced storms, unlike anything the island had ever seen. The arrival of the Vikings marked the first major wave of external pressure, transforming Ireland's political landscape and reshaping the rhythm of everyday life. These Norse raiders, sailors, and traders arrived suddenly in the late 8th century, cutting through the peace of monastic sanctuaries with terrifying speed. Their longships skimmed across the waves, carved dragon heads glinting in the sun, carrying warriors hardened by cold northern seas and driven by the promise of wealth. Ireland's monasteries, centers of learning, craftsmanship, and accumulated treasure became irresistible targets. When the Vikings first landed, their attacks were swift and brutal. They struck at places like Lambay Island, Rathlin, and later at major monastic centers such as Iona and Clonmacnoise. The monks who had for generations guarded sacred texts and shared spiritual devotion now faced warriors who showed little regard for sanctity. The raiders plundered gold, silver, jewelry, and even kidnapped monks and villagers to be sold into slavery. The shock of these attacks echoed across the island, shaking the confidence of kings, chieftains, and abbots alike. But even in the face of chaos, Ireland did not collapse. Its fragmented political structure, composed of small kingdoms and regional powers, made coordinated defense difficult. Yet it also allowed certain regions to escape attack, while others bore the brunt. Over time, the Viking presence in Ireland evolved. What began as hit-and-run raids transformed into long-term settlement. Norsemen established fortified coastal bases known as longforts, which later grew into towns, something Ireland had never seen before. Dublin, founded by Vikings in 841, would become a major trading hub, connecting Ireland with the wider world. Other Viking towns, such as Limerick, Waterford, Wexford, and Cork, took root, each adding new layers of economic and cultural complexity to the island. These settlements brought trade in furs, textiles, wine, silver, and slaves. They also brought new technologies, shipbuilding techniques, and different methods of warfare. The Vikings were not simply invaders. Many became integrated into Irish society. Intermarriage between Norse settlers and Irish families became common. Over generations, cultural blending produced communities known as Hibernanors, people who embraced both Irish and Scandinavian customs. Their artwork, languages, and crafts reflected this fusion. Excavations in Dublin reveal a bustling medieval town with workshops, markets, and streets laid out in a way very different from traditional Irish settlements. The Vikings introduced coinage to Ireland, a development that transformed trade and economy. They built harbors, marketplaces, and defensive structures, unintentionally laying groundwork for future urban life. Yet, even as towns grew, tensions simmered between Irish kingdoms and Viking rulers. The Irish chieftains saw the newcomers not just as foreigners, but as powerful rivals. Battles erupted frequently as Irish kings sought to reclaim lands or assert dominance over Viking enclaves. Some Irish rulers, however, formed alliances with Vikings to strengthen their own political ambitions. This complicated dance of war, diplomacy, and intermarriage shaped Irish politics for generations. It was during this period that figures like Cerbal Mac Dunlange of Osraj, Flann Sinna, and Niall Glandub rose to prominence, fighting battles that would define Ireland's regional power struggles. But among all the warriors and kings of this era, one name towers above the rest: Brian Boru. Born into the D.L. Gacy clan in the region of modern-day County Clare, Brian grew up in a time of violence, ambition, and shifting alliances. His family was not initially among Ireland's great dynasties, but through determination, strategic brilliance, and martial skill, Brian transformed them into one of the island's most powerful forces. Brian's rise to power was not simple. It took decades of warfare, negotiation, and political maneuvering. He steadily extended his influence across Munster, challenged older royal lines, and eventually became High King of Ireland. Brian's ambition went beyond mere rule. He sought to unify Ireland in a way no one had successfully done before. For generations, the idea of a single High King had existed more in theory than in practice. Ireland remained a patchwork of competing petty kingdoms, but Brian aimed to bind these regions under a single authority. bringing stability to an island long fractured by internal conflict. His greatest military achievement, the one that immortalized him in Irish memory, came at the Battle of Clontarf. Clontarf was not simply a struggle between Irish and Vikings, as later legends often portray it. It was a complicated conflict involving alliances on both sides' Irish factions, fighting other Irish facti. Yet the outcome of the battle left a profound mark on Ireland. Brian Boru's forces won a decisive victory, weakening the power of Viking rulers in Dublin and curbing their political influence. But the victory came at a tragic cost. Brian himself was killed reportedly in his tent praying, struck down by a fleeing Norse warrior. His death ended the dream of a fully unified Ireland, but his legend became a symbol of resistance and national pride for centuries. After Clontarf, Viking political power waned, though their cultural and economic impact remained. Dublin and other towns continued to flourish under mixed Norse leadership. As generations passed, Viking settlers became fully integrated into Irish society. Their descendants spoke Irish, followed Irish customs, and participated in the island's political struggles. The Viking era had ended, but its legacy was woven into Ireland's fabric. Towns, trade networks, and cultural diversity would endure. Long after the last longship rotted away as the island moved into the 12th century, a new force began to take shape, one that would change Ireland's destiny even more profoundly than the Vikings. This force came not from the north, but from across the Irish Sea, where the Kingdom of England was consolidating under a centralizing monarchy. Before the English ever set foot in Ireland, the country was already experiencing significant internal change. The political landscape was shifting. New, ambitious kings sought dominance over others, and long-standing rivalries intensified. One of the most powerful figures of this age was Dermot Mac Murchada, the King of Leinster, man whose decisions would alter the fate of Ireland forever. Dermot's rule was marked by conflict. His ambition and ruthlessness earned him enemies among both the Irish nobility and the clergy. A complex feud with the High King Ruadhri Ua Concaber led to Dermot's exile. But Dermot, refusing to accept defeat, undertook a move that would open Ireland to foreign invasion for the first time in its history. He sought help from King Henry II of England. Dermot pleaded for assistance in reclaiming his throne, offering land and loyalty in exchange. Henry, always eager to expand his influence, granted Dermot permission to recruit Norman lords, powerful, skilled warriors with a reputation for brutal efficiency. Among those who answered the call was Richard de Clare, better known as Strongbow, seasoned Norman nobleman. Strongbow saw in Dermot's proposal an opportunity. When he and his forces landed on Irish shores in 1169, they brought with them advanced military technology, heavy armor, disciplined cavalry, siege engines, and a method of warfare unlike anything Ireland had faced before. Their arrival shocked the Irish kings, who were divided and unprepared for such a formidable force. Strongbow quickly proved his prowess, capturing towns like Wexford, Waterford, and finally Dublin. Dermot regained his throne, but his reliance on the Normans had created a new problem, one that would outlast all who lived at the time. When Dermot died, shortly after reclaiming power, Strongbow became not just an ally, but a successor, laying claim to Leinster through his marriage to Dermot's daughter. alarmed by Strongbow's growing authority, King Henry II took action. He sailed to Ireland in 1171, making himself the first English king to set foot on Irish soil. Henry declared Ireland under his lordship, bringing the Norman conquest under direct royal authority. This marked the beginning of English involvement in Ireland, an involvement that would stretch over centuries, bringing periods of colonization, resistance, rebellion, and profound cultural change. The Normans, under Henry's governance, established a new political order. They built stone castles across the regions. They controlled structures unlike anything the Irish had previously constructed. These castles became centers of Norman power, projecting authority over surrounding lands and resisting attacks from Irish rivals. They introduced feudalism, reshaping land ownership, social hierarchy, and governance. Towns expanded, trade increased, and new legal systems emerged. Churches and monasteries were reorganized to align with continental practices, linking Ireland more closely with Rome. The Normans were skilled administrators, but they were also adaptable. Over generations, many Norman families integrated into Irish society, much like the Vikings had centuries earlier. Their descendants spoke Irish, adopted Irish customs, intermarried with Irish elites, and became what later historians called the Old English. They often identified more with Ireland than with England, a fact that frustrated English monarchs. Seeking to maintain control, laws like the Statutes of Kilkenny attempted to stop this blending by forbidding the Anglo-Normans from adopting Irish language or customs. But such attempts often failed. Ireland's cultural pull was strong, and many Normans became more Irish than the Irish themselves. Despite this blending, tension between English governance and Irish autonomy persisted. The English crown claimed authority over the entire island, but in practice, its control was often limited to the Pala fortified region around Dublin. Beyond the Pale, Irish kingdoms and Norman Irish lords ruled with considerable independence. This fragmented political landscape would shape Ireland for generations, creating a delicate balance between cooperation, resistance, and negotiation. As centuries passed, the foundations laid during the Norman-era towns, castles, trade networks, legal structures became deeply embedded in Irish society, but the seeds of future conflict were planted as well. The question of who held legitimate authority over Ireland lingered unresolved and contentious. The arrival of the Normans had shifted the island into a new political orbit, connecting it more directly with the ambitions of English kings. Ireland was no longer isolated. It was now part of a larger geopolitical struggle, pulled into the orbit of continental politics and Anglo-European power dynamics. The era of Vikings had reshaped Ireland's towns and trade. The era of Normans reshaped its governance, land, ownership, and political identity. Through it all, Irish culture endured fluid, resilient, and deeply rooted, but ahead lay centuries of struggle, conflicts over land, identity, religion, and sovereignty. The events of this period were only the beginning of a story that would unfold across medieval, early modern, and modern history, a story marked by resistance and adaptation, conquest and survival, loss and enduring spirit. Ireland's story, in the late medieval and early modern periods, unfolds in waves of dramatic transformation, moments of cultural renewal, political upheaval, and a growing struggle for sovereignty. The Norman arrival had reshaped the island's political landscape, but the centuries that followed saw an even deeper entanglement between Ireland and England. What began as a handful of Norman lords carving out territories eventually developed into a long, complex contest over authority, identity, and faith. As the medieval world gave way to the dawn of modern Europe, Ireland found itself caught in a tightening web of English governance, religious divisions, shifting alliances, and resistance that spanned generations. In the aftermath of the Norman conquest, English rule in Ireland was initially strong in theory, yet fragile in practice. While kings in London claimed lordship over the entire island, their actual control was usually limited to strategic regions, especially the Pale, a fortified area centered around Dublin. Beyond it stretched a patchwork of Irish kingdoms and semi-autonomous Norman-Irish lordships. Over time, many Norman families became deeply integrated with Irish culture. They adopted the Irish language, forged alliances with local clans, and often behaved as independent rulers rather than loyal English subjects. This blending, known as Gallicization, frustrated English monarchs who feared losing influence in their claimed territories. The English crown attempted repeatedly to reassert its authority, passing laws such as the Statutes of Kilkenny in 1366, which tried to forbid the adoption of Irish customs by English settlers. These laws banned intermarriage, Irish clothing, the use of the Irish language, and even participation in traditional Irish games. But like many attempts at cultural suppression, they were largely unsuccessful. Irish identity, flexible, yet deeply rooted, proved alluring. English settlers continued to mix with their Irish neighbors, forming powerful hybrid families such as the Fitzgeralds and Butlers, who became influential across the island. As the centuries advanced, the political balance of Ireland remained fluid. Clans fought for dominance. Norman Irish families ruled semi-independent territories, and English monarchs struggled to maintain meaningful control. For a time, England had too many concerns elsewhere: wars with France, internal rebellions, the turmoil of the Wars of the Roses to focus on Ireland. But everything changed in the 16th century when a new force emerged that reshaped Ireland's destiny: the Protestant Reformation. The Reformation brought religious division that reverberated across Europe, and Ireland became an unwilling battleground in this transformation. When Henry VIII broke away from the Catholic Church and declared himself head of the Church of England, the change was meant to extend across all lands under English rule. But Ireland was overwhelmingly Catholic, its clergy, its people, its traditions all deeply tied to Rome. Henry's religious policies were met with resistance, which only deepened under his successors, Edward VI, Mary, and finally Elizabeth I, under whom Protestantism became a defining feature of the English state. Elizabeth's reign marked a turning point in Anglo-Irish relations, determined to bring Ireland. The most famous and devastating of these rebellions was the 9 Years' War, led by Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone. O'Neill was a remarkable figure, skilled diplomat, strategist, and leader who united Irish clans and Norman Irish lords in a rare alliance against English expansion. His victory at the Battle of the Yellow Ford in 1598 sent shockwaves through the English government. It was one of the worst defeats England suffered in Ireland, Yet, despite this triumph, the Irish alliance struggled to secure lasting victory. England committed enormous military resources, and the tide eventually turned. At the decisive Battle of Kinsale in 1601, Irish forces, joined by a long-awaited Spanish fleet, faced a well-prepared English army. The defeat at Kinsale crushed Irish hopes of resisting English rule. O'Neill, along with other Irish leaders, fled the country in 1607 in what became known as the Flight of the Earls. This event marked the end of Gaelic Ireland as it had existed. For centuries, the old order of chieftains, clan lands, and traditional governance was dismantled. In its place, England sought to impose a new system of land, ownership, and political authority. The collapse of Gaelic leadership paved the way for one of the most transformative and devastating eras in Irish history, the Plantation period. The English crown seized vast territories, especially in Ulster, which had been home to some of Ireland's most powerful Gaelic families. These lands were redistributed to English and Scottish Protestant settlers who were encouraged to establish new towns, farms, and fortifications. For the native Irish, this meant displacement, loss of ancestral land, and the beginning of a deep sectarian divide that would echo into the modern era. The Ulster Plantation fundamentally altered the social fabric of the region. Settlers brought with them different languages, legal systems, economic practices, and religious doctrines. Over time, they created communities that were distinct from their Irish neighbors, not just in land ownership, but in cultural identity. These settlers, many of whom were Presbyterian Scots or English Protestants, developed loyalties to the English crown and a suspicion toward the Catholic majority. This mistrust grew over generations, fueling conflicts that would shape centuries of Irish history. As plantations expanded and English control tightened, tensions erupted into violent conflict once again during the mid-17th century. The Irish Rebellion of 1641 became a flashpoint, sparked by anger over land confiscation and religious discrimination. The uprising involved attacks on Protestant settlers, which were later exaggerated and used by English politicians to justify harsh retaliation. The conflict soon merged with the wider wars of the Three Kingdoms, engulfing Ireland in a storm of violence and political chaos. The English Civil War saw royalists, parliamentarians, and Scottish forces each vying for influence in Ireland. Yet it was Oliver Cromwell whose name would be remembered with particular bitterness, who left the deepest scar, arriving in Ireland. In 1649, with a powerful army, Cromwell launched a brutal campaign to crush Irish resistance and subdue the island. The massacres at Drogheda and Wexford became infamous, symbolizing the extreme cruelty inflicted on towns that resisted. Cromwell's forces confiscated massive amounts of land, expelling Irish families to the poorer western regions. In the chilling phrase, "to hell or to Connaught," the social, economic, and demographic consequences of this conquest were profound. After Cromwell's campaigns, Ireland entered a period of harsh military rule, followed by attempts at reorganization under the Restoration monarchy. Yet the fundamental issues, land ownership, religious division, and political autonomy, remained unresolved. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 brought Protestant William of Orange to the English throne, sparking yet another conflict on Irish soil. As the Catholic King James II sought to regain his crown, the war between Williamite and Jacobite forces culminated in the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, a turning point that secured Protestant ascendancy in Ireland. The aftermath of the Williamite victory ushered in an era known as the Protestant ascendancy. Under this system, political and economic power was concentrated almost entirely in the hands of the Protestant minority. Catholics, who made up the vast majority of Ireland's population, faced a series of penal laws designed to suppress their religion, restrict their rights, and keep them in a subordinate position. They could not hold public office, own firearms, vote, or even receive an education in Catholic schools. Land ownership was severely limited, and inheritance laws weakened Catholic families by dividing property among sons instead of allowing a single heir. While Protestant elites enjoyed wealth and influence, the majority of Irish people lived in poverty, working as tenants on lands they no longer owned. Cultural suppression continued as well. The Irish language declined under pressures of political exclusion and economic hardship. Yet, despite these challenges, Irish communities found ways to preserve their faith, traditions, and identity, often in secret or through informal networks. Schools sprang up across the countryside, teaching children to read and write outside the reach of laws that banned Catholic education. Folk traditions, music, and storytelling thrived, keeping cultural memory alive, but resentment simmered. Ireland remained a land divided by religion, by land, by class, and by political loyalty. The 18th century saw growing demands for reform, inspired by Enlightenment ideas and revolutionary movements in America and France. In the late 1700s, the Society of United Irishmen emerged, led by figures like Wolfe Tone. They sought to unite Catholics and Protestants in a shared struggle for independence from British rule. The Rebellion of 1798, though ultimately unsuccessful, marked a turning point in Irish political consciousness. It showed that a new national identity was possible, one not limited to clan or religion, but based on the idea of an Irish nation. In the wake of the rebellion, the British government moved to tighten its grip on Ireland even further. In 1801, the Acts of Union formally merged Ireland with Great Britain, creating the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Dublin's Parliament was dissolved, and Irish political decisions were now made in London. Though the Union promised equality and economic progress, many Irish people viewed it as another step in the long erosion of their autonomy. The struggle for Catholic emancipation continued into the 19th century, led by Daniel O'Connell, whose mass political mobilization eventually forced the British government to grant Catholics the right to sit in Parliament. Even as Ireland entered the modern age, the legacy of earlier centuries remained deeply embedded in its landscape and collective memory. Land remained the most contentious issue. Generations of dispossession had left Irish farmers vulnerable to exploitation by absentee landlords who demanded high rents while investing little in their tenants. Welfare, poor living conditions, crop failures, and political marginalization converged in the single most devastating event in Irish history. The Great Famine of the 1840s, a potato blight, destroyed the main food source for millions, and British government responses were slow, inadequate, and often guided by economic ideology over humanitarian concern. Over 1 million people died. Another million emigrated. The trauma of the famine reshaped Ireland demographically, culturally, and politically. But the seeds of resistance, long planted, continued to grow. Land reform movements, nationalist organizations, and cultural revival efforts surged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The story that had begun centuries earlier with conquest, colonization, religious division, and struggle moved toward another moment of transformation, one that would eventually bring about the modern Irish state. The centuries covered in this part of the narrative reveal not only conflict but profound resilience. Despite conquest after conquest, plantation after plantation, suppression after suppression, the spirit of Ireland endured. Its people preserved their identity, their faith, their cultural memory, and their determination to one day reclaim their destiny. The history of this era is not simply a chronicle of domination. It is also a testament to survival, adaptation, and the enduring desire for freedom. The 20th century opened with Ireland standing at a crossroads, pulled between the weight of its colonial past and the rising hope of a self-governing future. For centuries, the Irish people had lived under English and later British rule, enduring political suppression, cultural erosion, and economic hardship. But by 1900, new flames of national identity were burning, shaped by decades of cultural revival and political awakening. These fires would soon erupt, reshaping the island entirely and giving birth to the modern nation of Ireland. The Gaelic revival of the late 19th century had breathed new life into Irish traditions. The Gaelic League encouraged people to speak Irish again, not as a relic of the past, but as a living symbol of national pride. Writers like W.B. Yeats and Lady Gregory celebrated Ireland's myths, heroes, and rural beauty through poetry and theatre. Everywhere, Ireland seemed to be rediscovering its soul. Meanwhile, political groups pushed for home rule, limited self-government within the United Kingdom, though it fell far short of full independence. Home rule represented a major step toward freedom for many Irish nationalists, but these cultural and political movements were not enough on their own. The tensions between Irish nationalists who largely sought autonomy or independence. In Ulster, Protestant Unionists formed the Ulster Volunteers to resist home rule by force if necessary. In response, nationalists created the Irish Volunteers. The island was splitting into two armed camps even before the First World War began. Then, 1916, arrived, a year that changed Ireland forever. On Easter Monday, a group of Irish rebels seized key buildings in Dublin and declared an independent Irish republic. The Easter Rising was small, brief, and militarily doomed, but its impact was seismic. For 6 days, Dublin echoed with gunfire. Before the rebels surrendered, the British response was swift and harsh. Most leaders were executed, but instead of crushing the dream of independence, the executions turned public sympathy toward the rebel cause. Many who once supported peaceful political change now saw armed rebellion as justified. By 1919, revolutions surged through the island. Sinn Féin, a nationalist political party, won overwhelming support in the Irish elections and declared a new independent government called Dáil Éireann. The Irish Republican Army (IRA) then launched a guerrilla war against British forces. This conflict, known as the Irish War of Independence, was brutal and unpredictable. Ambushes, reprisals, assassinations, and civilian suffering became part of daily life. The British government, struggling to contain the violence, deployed the notorious Black and Tansu's harsh tactics, further fueled Irish anger. In 1921, exhausted and recognizing the war could drag on endlessly, both sides sought a truce. The Anglo-Irish Treaty, signed later that year, created the Irish Free State Dominion within the British Empire, but it came with a heavy cost. Ireland was partitioned. The predominantly Protestant northern counties remained part of the United Kingdom as Northern Ireland. While many celebrated the treaty as a victory, others saw it as a betrayal of the ideal of a fully united independent republic. This division tore Ireland apart. Former comrades turned enemies as the Irish Civil War erupted in 1922. Pro-treaty forces supported by the new Free State government fought against the anti-treaty IRA, who rejected partition and dominion status. The violence was bitter and deeply personal. Brothers fought brothers, friends fought friends. By 1923, the pro-treaty side emerged victorious, but the wounds left by the war would linger for decades. With the Civil War over, the Free State focused on stabilizing itself. Despite economic struggles and lingering political tensions, the new government gradually took control of its own destiny. In 1937, a new constitution renamed the state Ire and asserted greater independence. Then, in 1949, Ireland formally became the Republic of Ireland, fully free from British governance. It was the culmination of centuries of struggle, sacrifice, and resilience. But even as the South celebrated independence, the North faced a very different reality. Northern Ireland remained part of the United Kingdom as its unionist majority desired. However, its Catholic nationalist minority lived under systematic discrimination in housing, employment, and political power. Over time, frustration and injustice grew into anger. By the 1960s, a civil rights movement emerged inspired by global calls for equality. Peaceful marches demanded justice, but instead of reform, protesters were often met with hostility and violence. Tensions escalated rapidly. This period spiraled into what became known as the Troubles, a conflict that scarred Northern Ireland for 3 decades, beginning around 1968 and lasting until 1998. The Troubles pitted Republican groups, most notably the Provisional IRA, against Unionist paramilitaries, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, and the British Army. Cities like Belfast and Derry became battlegrounds. Bombings, sectarian killings, riots, and military operations became grim parts of everyday life. Families lived in fear. Neighborhoods were divided by walls and checkpoints, and generations grew up knowing only conflict. The Troubles were not simply a war for territory. They represented a deep clash of identities: nationalist versus unionist, Catholic versus Protestant, Irish versus British. The conflict claimed over 3,500 lives and left countless others scarred by trauma. Yet, even in darkness, hope flickered. Decades of negotiation, sacrifice, and courage eventually led to the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, a landmark peace deal that established power sharing, recognized dual identities, and offered a path forward through dialogue rather than violence. Today, Ireland stands as a testament to endurance. From ancient stone circles to illuminated manuscripts, from Viking longships to rebel proclamations, its story is one of constant reinvention amid adversity. The island has known conquest, famine, exile, and division, but it has also known poetry, scholarship, music, and an unbreakable will to remember who it is. Ireland's journey reminds us that history is not just a record of events, it is a living current that shapes who we become. And in the heart of every Irish hill, river, and manuscript lies the echo of a people who refused to be forgotten.